The saloon doors didn't just open, they shattered off their iron hinges. Gideon Cole, a giant carved from granite and scarred by grisly claws, stepped into the dead silence. Every eligible corset-starved woman held her breath. But Gideon's terrifying roar bypassed the town beauties entirely. "I'll take the plump one." The year was 1878, and the silver mining town of Oak Haven, Colorado, was a place that traded in two currencies: cold, hard cash, and vicious, unforgiving gossip. Nestled in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, it was a town where a person's worth was weighed by the cut of their clothes and the slimness of their waist. Abigail Montgomery possessed neither a grand wardrobe nor a delicate, corseted figure. At 26, she was considered an old maid by the harsh standards of the frontier. She was a woman of generous curves, soft and plump, with hands that were calloused from kneading dough, and eyes the color of strong morning tea. When her father, Thomas, passed away in a mining cave-in, he left her nothing but his debts and the deed to a struggling bakery on the edge of Main Street. In an era where women were expected to faint at the sight of a mouse, Abigail spent her dawns hauling 50-pound sacks of flour and her nights battling the crushing weight of loneliness. The town's polite society tolerated her only because her sourdough and cinnamon loaves were the only decent things to eat within 50 miles. But behind her back, the whispers were cruel. The cruelest of all belonged to Clementine Higgins. Clementine was the daughter of Mayor Josiah Higgins, a man whose pockets were lined with the town's stolen tax dollars. Clementine was a vision of prairie perfection, slim as a willow branch, constantly strapped into bone-crushing corsets, and possessing a heart as dark as a coal shaft. "You're eating up your own profits again, I see, Abigail." Clementine had sneered just 3 days before the Founders' Day matrimonial gala, leaning over the bakery counter. She tapped a gloved finger against the glass case, her eyes raking over Abigail's rounded hips. "My father sent me to remind you about the back taxes. $500, due by the end of the month. If you can't pay, the town takes the bakery." Abigail's heart had dropped into her stomach. 500? Josiah told me it was 200 just last week. "Interest, my dear," Clementine smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in her eye. "But father has a charitable solution. You will enter yourself into the Founders' Day matrimonial auction this Saturday. A percentage of your winning bid will go toward your debt." It was a public humiliation disguised as charity. The matrimonial auction was an archaic Oak Haven tradition. The unmarried women of the town were paraded onto a stage at the saloon, and the wealthy miners and ranchers bid on them. The winning bid secured the woman's companionship for a month, a thinly veiled courtship ritual that often ended in marriage. Clementine, naturally, was expected to fetch the highest price in the county. Abigail knew exactly what would happen to her. She would stand on that stage, heavy and awkward, and receive pity bids, or worse, no bids at all. But she had no choice. She couldn't lose her father's bakery. While Abigail braced herself for a night of misery, the mountains looming over Oak Haven held a secret of their own. His name was Gideon Cole. Gideon was a phantom, a mountain man who lived on an isolated claim high up on Bitterroot Ridge. He only came down to Oak Haven twice a year for supplies, and when he did, the town parted for him like the Red Sea. He stood 6'4" in his scuffed leather boots, his shoulders as broad as a barn door. But it wasn't his size that terrified the townsfolk, it was his face. A jagged, gruesome scar tore across the left side of Gideon's face, starting from his temple, carving through his eyebrow, and trailing down to his jaw. Legend said he'd wrestled a massive grizzly bear barehanded to save a lost child. Others whispered he was an outlaw who had survived a knife fight with a dozen bounty hunters. Gideon never confirmed the rumors. He simply bought his salt, his ammunition, and his coffee in terrifying, brooding silence. Except for one encounter, exactly 6 months prior. It had been a freezing November morning. Gideon had walked into Abigail's bakery, tracking snow onto the floorboards. The few customers inside had fled instantly. Gideon had approached the counter, his imposing frame blocking out the morning sun, his scarred face grim and unreadable. Abigail hadn't run. She hadn't even gasped. She had simply looked up at him, her warm brown eyes meeting his startlingly clear blue ones, and asked, "Fresh out of the oven. Apple or cherry, Mr. Cole?" Gideon had stared at her for a long, silent moment. His eyes had dropped to her flour-dusted apron, taking in the soft, unapologetic swell of her curves, the flush of heat on her cheeks, and the absolute lack of fear in her posture. "Apple," his voice had rumbled, deep and rough as gravel. When he handed her a gold coin to pay for a 10-cent pie, she had tried to give him change. He had wrapped his massive, scarred hand over her soft, plump fingers, his touch surprisingly warm. "Keep it, Baker," he had muttered, and then he was gone. Now, as the Founders' Day auction approached, rumors exploded through Oakhaven. A surveyor had come down from the mountain, sputtering in disbelief. Gideon Cole hadn't just been trapping up on the ridge, he had struck a vein of pure silver. The scarred mountain man was suddenly the wealthiest man in the Colorado Territory. Overnight, the town's terror of Gideon turned into rabid greed, and Clementine Higgins set her sights on the beast of Bitterroot. The air inside the Golden Spur Saloon was thick with cigar smoke, cheap violet perfume, and the desperate sweat of 100 miners with fresh paychecks. The center of the room had been cleared, leaving a raised wooden platform where the auction would take place. Mayor Josiah Higgins stood at the podium, his face flushed with whiskey and authority, holding a wooden gavel. In the back room, the eligible women of Oakhaven waited. Clementine stood before a full-length mirror, pinching her cheeks to make them red. She wore a dress of imported green silk, her waist corseted so tightly she could barely take a full breath. "I heard Gideon Cole rode into town an hour ago," Clementine whispered to her gaggle of friends, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "He went straight to the bank. They say he's carrying a fortune. He's rough, but with my guidance and his money, I'll be running Denver in a year." Abigail sat in the darkest corner of the room, her hands folded in her lap. She wore her best dress, a simple, homemade cotton gown in a deep burgundy. It fit her well, hugging the full swell of her bust and the wide curve of her hips, but next to the glittering silk and lace of the other women, she felt like a draft horse at a thoroughbred show. Her stomach twisted into nauseating knots. She just wanted it to be over. The auction began. The noise in the saloon swelled as the mayor called the women out one by one. Cheers erupted, bids were shouted, and money changed hands. $50, $100, $200. The miners were generous, eager for a hot meal and the company of a clean woman. Then it was Clementine's turn. She practically glided onto the stage, twirling her parasol. The room went wild. Men started shouting over each other, throwing their hats in the air. $100, $200, $400. Mayor Higgins beamed, slamming his gavel. "Do I hear 500 for my beautiful daughter? 500? Suddenly, the saloon doors at the back of the room swung open with a violent crack. The shouting died instantly. The piano player stopped mid-chord. Gideon Cole stood in the doorway. He wore a heavy leather duster coated in trail dust, a Stetson pulled low over his eyes, and a dark scowl that promised violence. The terrible scar on his face seemed to catch the flickering lantern light. He looked less like a man and more like a force of nature that had decided to walk indoors. Clementine's eyes widened, and she thrust her chest forward, offering Gideon a sultry, inviting smile. She waited for him to step forward and shout a bid that would shatter records. Gideon didn't even look at her. He leaned his massive frame against the back wall, crossed his arms over his chest, and waited in absolute silence. Flustered, Mayor Higgins banged his gavel. "Sold, for $400 to Mr. Harrison." Clementine's smile vanished, her face contorting in fury as she was ushered off the stage. Gideon Cole hadn't even blinked in her direction. "And now," Mayor Higgins announced, his voice dropping a full octave, dripping with manufactured pity, "our final lady of the evening, Miss Abigail Montgomery." Abigail's legs felt like lead as she walked up the wooden stairs. The silence in the room was entirely different from the awe that had greeted Clementine. This was the silence of embarrassment. She stood under the harsh glare of the lanterns. She could see the men looking away, whispering to each other, scratching their necks. "Well, gentlemen," Mayor Higgins laughed nervously, "Miss Montgomery is a fine baker. Do we have an opening bid? Shall we start at $10? Silence. Abigail stared at the floorboards, her face burning with a humiliation so profound it brought hot tears to the corners of her eyes. She prayed the floor would open up and swallow her whole. $5? Higgins asked, leaning on the podium. From the front row, Cletus, the town drunk, let out a loud burp. I'll give you 2 pennies and a half-empty bottle of rye for the fat one. A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the room. Clementine, standing by the bar, giggled behind her hand. Abigail closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. It was over. She was a public joke, and tomorrow Higgins would take her father's bakery. I'll take the plump one. The roar shook the dust from the saloon rafters. It was a voice like thunder tearing through a canyon. The laughter choked and died. Every head in the room snapped toward the back wall. Gideon Cole pushed himself off the wall and began walking toward the stage. The crowd scrambled out of his way, practically climbing over tables to avoid touching his leather duster. His jaw was clenched, his blue eyes burning with a terrifying, absolute fury. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the stage, towering over Mayor Higgins. Gideon reached inside his coat and pulled out a heavy canvas sack. He slammed it onto the mayor's podium with so much force the wood splintered. The sack tipped over, spilling a cascade of glittering, raw silver nuggets onto the floor. $5,000, Gideon growled, his voice vibrating through the dead silent room. For the baker. Mayor Higgins's jaw dropped. His eyes bulged as he stared at the fortune rolling across his boots. 5,000? He stammered, the greed instantly wiping away his shock. Mr. Cole, surely you mean to bid on Clementine. There's been a mistake, she. Gideon drew a massive Colt revolver from his hip and slammed the barrel onto the podium, pinning one of the silver nuggets. I didn't stutter, Higgins, Gideon sneered, the scar on his face twisting into a terrifying snarl. I said, I'll take the plump one. Now drop the damn hammer. Higgins swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he grabbed his wooden gavel. Bang. Sold. To Mr. Gideon Cole. Abigail stood frozen, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She watched as this giant, this terrifying beast of a man, holstered his weapon and turned his gaze up to her. The raw fury in his face vanished, replaced by something entirely unreadable. He walked up the 3 steps to the stage. He stopped inches from her. She had to crane her neck to look up at him. She was terrified, yet, surrounded by the scent of pine, leather, and rain that clung to him, she felt an absurd, sudden rush of safety. Mr. Cole, Abigail whispered, her voice trembling, I am not a prize pig to be bought at auction. I don't know what kind of game you're playing. Gideon reached out. The crowd gasped, expecting violence. Instead, his calloused, massive hand gently wrapped around her soft waist. You ain't bought, Miss Montgomery, he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it. You're saved. Now, do exactly as I say. Smile at me, and let's get the hell out of here. Before she could process his words, Gideon turned to the crowd. The auction is over, he announced to the stunned room. He looked directly at Mayor Higgins. Miss Montgomery is coming with me to the Ridge, as my wife. Chaos erupted in the saloon. Clementine let out a shriek of absolute outrage, hurling her champagne glass at the wall. Men shouted in disbelief. But as Gideon escorted Abigail off the stage, shielding her soft body with his massive frame, he leaned his head down, his lips brushing against her ear. The twist of his next words made Abigail's blood run cold. Keep walking, Abigail, Gideon whispered urgently. Don't look back. Josiah Higgins didn't put you up here to humiliate you. He put you up here as an alibi. In exactly 10 minutes, his men are going to burn your bakery to the ground because of what your father hid beneath the floorboards. The cold November air hit Abigail like a physical blow as Gideon shoved her through the saloon's side exit and into the pitch-black alleyway. The sounds of outrage inside the Golden Spur were muffled as he dragged her behind a stack of whiskey barrels. My bakery, Abigail gasped, trying to keep up with his massive, ground-eating strides. Gideon, what do you mean? My father was just a baker. He didn't have anything to hide. Your father was a lot of things, Abigail, but a fool wasn't one of them, Gideon growled, his hand securely wrapped around hers. Keep your voice down. We have less than 5 minutes before Higgins realizes we didn't head for the stables. They sprinted through the muddy back streets of Oakhaven, the shadows of the false front buildings hiding their escape. As they neared the end of Main Street, Abigail smelled it. The sharp, unmistakable stench of coal oil. Her heart lodged in her throat. Through the back window of her bakery, a flicker of orange light danced. Gideon didn't hesitate. He drew his Colt revolver, kicked the heavy oak back door with a boot the size of an anvil, and shattered the lock. Inside, two men were splashing kerosene over the flour sacks and the wooden counters. One of them, a deputy named Roscoe, was just striking a match. "Drop it!" Gideon roared. Startled, Roscoe spun around, but Gideon was already moving. The mountain man closed the distance with terrifying speed, slamming the heavy barrel of his gun across Roscoe's jaw. The deputy crumpled instantly, the unlit match flying from his fingers. The second man went for his holster, but Gideon grabbed him by the lapels, lifting him entirely off his feet and hurling him through the bakery's side window. The glass shattered, and the man landed in the dirt outside, groaning. "The floorboards, Abigail!" Gideon shouted, holstering his weapon and grabbing an iron crowbar from the hearth. "Where did your father spend the most time? Where did he obsess over the sweeping?" Abigail's mind raced. The panic was blinding, but she forced herself to think. "The proofing oven," she breathed, pointing to the brick enclave in the corner. "He never let me clean the hearthstones beneath it." Gideon dropped to his knees, his massive shoulders strained, muscles bunching under his leather duster as he wedged the crowbar between the heavy stones. With a harsh grunt, he snapped the mortar. He hurled the stones aside, revealing a hollowed-out cavity in the earth. Inside sat a rusted, heavy iron lockbox. Just as Gideon pulled the box free, a gunshot rang out. The window above Abigail's head exploded. Higgins' men had arrived. "We're out of time!" Gideon yelled. He didn't wait for her to run. He scooped Abigail up into his left arm as if she weighed no more than a sack of sugar, clutching the lockbox in his right. He bolted out the back door just as a volley of bullets tore through the bakery walls. Behind the bakery, hidden in the thick brush, was a massive black draft horse. Gideon tossed the lockbox into a saddlebag, hoisted Abigail up into the saddle, and vaulted up behind her. "Hold on to me," he commanded. Abigail wrapped her arms tightly around his solid waist, pressing her face against his broad back. Gideon kicked the horse into a brutal gallop. They tore out of Oakhaven, the hooves thundering against the frozen earth. As they reached the tree line of Bitterroot Ridge, Abigail looked back over her shoulder. A massive pillar of fire was clawing its way into the night sky. Her bakery, her father's legacy, was burning to the ground. Tears streamed down her cheeks, soaking into the rough fabric of Gideon's coat. But as the horse climbed higher into the treacherous, winding mountain trails, the terrifying beast of Bitterroot did something entirely unexpected. He reached back with one calloused hand, gently covering her trembling fingers where they clutched his waist, offering a silent, steadying comfort. They rode for hours, deep into the heart of the wilderness, until they reached a sturdy log cabin hidden behind a cascading waterfall. Once inside, Gideon barred the heavy door, stoked the wood stove, and placed the rusted lockbox on the wooden table. Using his hunting knife, he snapped the lock. Abigail stepped forward, shivering despite the fire, her soft curves wrapped in a woolen blanket Gideon had draped over her shoulders. She peered into the box. There was no gold, no silver nuggets, just a stack of meticulously kept ledgers, land deeds, and several letters bearing an official, terrifying seal. "The Pinkerton National Detective Agency," Abigail read aloud, her voice shaking. She looked up at Gideon, completely bewildered. "These are signed by William A. Pinkerton himself, Chicago headquarters." "Your father wasn't just a baker," Gideon said quietly, pulling off his Stetson and running a hand through his dark hair. "He was a quiet informant. For the last 2 years, Higgins has been stealing federal municipal funds and using them to illegally buy up the valley's land deeds under fake names." Abigail gasped. "Why?" "Because the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad is coming," Gideon explained, his blue eyes locking onto hers. Higgins knew the planned route. "He was going to sell the stolen land back to the railroad for a fortune. Your father found out. He started keeping a ledger, tracking every stolen dollar, every forged deed. He sent a letter to Pinkerton right before he died, in that accidental cave-in." "Higgins murdered my father," Abigail whispered, the horrific realization hitting her like a train. She stumbled back, her knees hitting a wooden chair, and she collapsed into it, sobbing. "And tonight, Higgins put me up for auction to get me out of the building so he could burn the evidence." Gideon knelt in front of her. The fearsome mountain man, the beast who terrified entire towns, looked up at her with a gentleness that broke her heart. He tried, Abigail, but he failed, because we have the ledger. Abigail sniffled, wiping her eyes. She looked at the giant kneeling before her. Gideon, who are you? Really? You had $5,000 in raw silver. You knew about my father. You knew they were coming. A slow, wry smile touched Gideon's lips, shifting the terrible scar on his face. I'm not a miner, sweetheart. I didn't strike silver up here. That bag of nuggets was federal bait money. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a heavy silver star. I'm Senior Operative Gideon Cole, Pinkerton Detective Agency. William Pinkerton sent me here 6 months ago to finish your father's work and keep you alive. The ride up the Bitterroot Trail was a blur of freezing wind, whipping pine branches, and the distant, terrifying pops of gunfire. Abigail clung to Gideon's heavy leather coat, pressing her face against his broad chest. Beneath his rough, terrifying exterior, she could hear the steady, calm beating of his heart. They reached the summit just as the moon broke through the storm clouds. Gideon's home was not the dilapidated trapper's shack the gossiping townsfolk mocked. It was a veritable fortress. The sprawling, expertly crafted cabin featured thick, interlocking pine logs, a slate roof, and heavy iron shutters. Gideon carried her inside, slamming and bolting the heavy oak door. The cabin was surprisingly warm, smelling of cedarwood, dried herbs, and clean linen. He set her gently on a velvet armchair near the stone hearth. Load these, Gideon commanded, tossing 2 heavy Colt revolvers and a box of brass ammunition onto the table. He didn't treat her like a fragile, fainting prairie flower. He looked at her with a fierce trust that made her pulse race. Abigail's hands shook, but she remembered her father teaching her how to shoot. She slotted the heavy cartridges into the cylinders. Gideon, how do you know Governor Rout? How do you know the truth about my father? Gideon grabbed a Winchester rifle from the wall, checking the lever action. He paused, turning his scarred face toward the firelight. The jagged lines of ruined flesh looked stark, a brutal map of frontier violence. I wasn't mauled by a bear, Abigail, he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. 3 years ago, I was a deputy U.S. Marshal. I got too close to Higgins' smuggling ring. They ambushed me. They tied me to a chair in a blasting shack and lit a bundle of dynamite. Abigail gasped, her flour-dusted hand flying to her mouth. I survived, Gideon muttered, his blue eyes dropping to the floorboards. But the blast ruined my face. I couldn't be a visible lawman anymore. The governor sent me up here to hide, to play the boogeyman of the Bitterroot, while your father gathered the paperwork in secret. I watched you for 3 years, Abigail. I watched you carry that ungrateful town on your back, feeding them, while they mocked you. He walked over, kneeling so he was eye level with her. His massive, calloused hand reached out, gently cupping her soft, plump cheek. When you offered me that pie 6 months ago, Gideon whispered, his voice cracking with raw emotion, you didn't flinch. You looked right at this ugly, broken face, and you just saw a man who was hungry. You're soft, Abigail. But you are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known. I didn't buy you tonight for a mission. I bought you because if I had to watch that town laugh at you for 1 more second, I was going to burn Oakhaven to the ground myself. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. For her entire life she had been told she was too heavy, too plain. Yet here, in the arms of the most dangerous man in the Colorado Territory, she was treasured. Before she could answer, the thunder of hooves echoed outside. Cole, Higgins' voice rang out, laced with panic. Send the girl out with the book, and we'll let you live. Gideon stood, instantly shifting from tender protector to apex predator. Stay down, he ordered. He unlatched the iron slot in the window shutter and shoved the rifle barrel through. You're out of your jurisdiction, Josiah, and you're out of time. Gunfire erupted. Bullets pelted the thick logs like angry hail. Gideon fired back with lethal precision, his Winchester roaring. Abigail crawled across the floorboards, pushing the freshly loaded revolvers to his boots. They're bringing a powder keg, she screamed, spotting 2 deputies dragging a wooden barrel toward the porch. Not today, Gideon snarled. He took careful aim and fired. The bullet struck the brass banding of the keg. The explosion rocked the mountain, shattering the remaining glass and sending Higgins flying backward into the snow. Silence descended on the ridge. Gideon kicked the front door open, revolvers drawn. Higgins was crawling through the snow, bleeding and defeated. Gideon's heavy boot pinned the corrupt mayor's wrist to the ice. By morning, the U.S. cavalry had arrived from Leadville. Higgins and his surviving deputies were bound and led down the mountain. Oakhaven was finally purged of its poison. Gideon stood on his porch, watching the lawmen disappear. Abigail stepped out, wrapping her arms around his waist. She didn't wear a corset. She was wonderfully, perfectly soft. Gideon pulled her flush against him. "You lost your bakery," Gideon murmured, kissing her forehead. "But I have $5,000 in silver. We can rebuild it." Abigail reached up, her soft fingers tracing his jagged scar. "I don't need a bakery in town," she smiled. "I think I'd rather bake up here, for my husband." Gideon swept his beautiful bride into his arms, carrying her back into the warmth of their home. What a wild ride! Abigail thought her weight and status made her unlovable, but she captured the heart of the fiercest man in Colorado and helped bring down a corrupt empire. True love doesn't care about society's cruel standards. If you loved this thrilling tale of Western romance, justice, and finding love in unexpected places, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life dramas.